What if I told you that a teenager just outsmarted an entire courtroom? A judge mocks him, a prosecutor laughs in his face, and the entire legal system assumes they've already won. But in just a few minutes, this 19-year-old defendant would do the unthinkable. He wouldn't just defend himself. He would dismantle their entire case piece by piece. And when the truth finally came out, the judge was left stunned, the courtroom was left speechless, and the real story began. This isn't just a case of a teenager proving his innocence. It's a case that exposes the cracks in a system that was built to break people like him. So, sit tight because you don't want to miss what happens next. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air was thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves, already convinced they knew how this case would end. At the front, standing at the defendant's table, was Jalen Dawson. He was just 19. His hands rested loosely in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Across from him sat Judge Walter Grayson, a man who had seen hundreds of cases like this before. To him, this wasn't about justice. It was just another routine hearing. His fingers drummed lazily against the polished wood of his desk as he stared down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses. With a smirk playing at his lips, he leaned back and scoffed. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" The judge's voice carried dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." The courtroom chuckled. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, smirked at the remark. It was clear. They weren't taking Jalen seriously. But Jalen? He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact moment. He never expected to be on trial himself, but he knew this courtroom better than most law students. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and every night he listened to her stories. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how defense attorneys sometimes barely even tried. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most professionals. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another young man in trouble. Grayson sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Because Jalen, he smirked too. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Because Judge Grayson had just made his first mistake. And the courtroom hadn't noticed it yet. The courtroom was still amused, still entertained by the judge's dismissive attitude. They thought this was open and shut. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. What more was there to discuss? The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, walking toward the jury box, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." His words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. Judge Grayson nodded. "Sounds straightforward to me," he said, barely hiding his boredom. And to most people in the room, it did sound straightforward. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks in this case. Still, he waited, watching, listening. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned toward Jalen's court-appointed lawyer, Lisa Thornton. She had barely said 3 words since the case began. She hesitated, then finally stood. "Your Honor, my client—" But before she could say another word, Jalen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated again, then slowly sat back down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went silent. Judge Grayson blinked. He stared at Jalen like he had just grown another head. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice remained calm. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. The spectators leaned in. Even Carrington, the prosecutor, let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting, but no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. He adjusted his stance, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington smirked, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen took a slow step forward. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's right." "And that testimony is written in his report?" "Of course it is." Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The courtroom shifted. Grayson frowned. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history." He let the words hang in the air. "But I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Grayson glanced at Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jalen gave a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't?" He let the sentence trail off. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's true." He took a slow step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling." He let the silence stretch, then continued. "But let's think about this logically." He took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm, controlled. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. His voice didn't waver. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside, just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington, The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly, "No." Jalen's lips pressed together. "So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis." Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded like that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. Jalen took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud, "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held the paper up. "That's from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Jalen shook his head. "Number I wasn't?" His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything." He let his next words land with force. "The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to the jury. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Jalen for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke, the words that would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence. Then, chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped, but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "You should consider law school." Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps. Their cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward like weapons. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. She shook her head, then let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one." Across the street, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first.